Welcome back, fourth graders. This is day 3 of George versus George. We're going to start with the shot heard round the world. British General Thomas Gage had been trying hard to keep peace in Massachusetts, but he was ordered in the name of the king to use more force. In April 1775, a spy in Boston warned Gage that colonial troublemakers were stashing big piles of ammunition in nearby Concord. Ammunition means weapons. This was bad news. A bloody war could break out. Gage decided that the British Army had better go seize John Hancock and Sam Adams, two rebel leaders who were hiding out in Lexington. Then they should burn the weapons in Concord before people started getting themselves killed. Gage quickly planned a secret raid. A British regiment shivered through a chilly night, rowing and then wading across the Charles River. On the morning of April 19th, the soldiers had marched as far as Lexington when they came across about 70 Patriot militia gathered on the village green. The rebels were armed because rebel spies William Dawes and Paul Revere had spread the alarm that the British were on their way. Lexington. Everybody's nerves were on edge. Still holding their weapons, the Patriots began to back away and look for cover. Then someone fired a shot. Nobody knows who. But as soon as they heard it, the British soldiers started shooting. 8 Americans were killed and 10 more were wounded. Not everyone realized it at the time, but the Revolutionary War had just begun. John Hancock and Sam Adams had disappeared. The Redcoats marched on to Concord to destroy the ammunition, but most of the ammunition had vanished too. Meanwhile, great multitudes of men from farms and villages all over the country gathered to fight back. Go ahead and pause and take a look at all these little different speech bubbles by different people who were at Lexington and Concord. Each side told a different tale about Lexington and Concord. Rebel newspapers reported that bloodthirsty redcoats burned houses, drove naked women into the streets, and butchered old men and infants. The king was told that rebel savages broke the rules of war by ambushing his army. Then they scalped fallen British infantry and cut off their ears. George Washington was already famous for his fearless leadership. When he had fought alongside the British 20 years earlier on June 15, 1775, the Second Continental Congress gathered in Philadelphia and unanimously elected the 43-year-old Virginian to become commander-in-chief of the newly formed Continental Army. But how could a small, poorly trained army with almost no money defeat one of the world's most awesome military powers? Washington refused to accept any salary, that means any money, asking only that Congress pay his expenses. The very next morning, long before Washington took command of his troops, the Redcoats back in Massachusetts awoke to discover an amazing sight. In just one night, about 1,200 rebels had secretly built a massive fort atop Breed's Hill by Charleston. Both sides fought fiercely until the rebels finally ran out of gunpowder and ammunition. The rebels ended up losing the hill, but the British lost 92 officers, more than half their men, and more than twice as many soldiers as the rebels lost. So at the end of this battle, even though the Americans lost their hillside where they were keeping their troops, the British lost a lot of their men. You can pause here and read about the Battle of Bunker Hill. British forces. King George made it official. The colonists were rebel outlaws misled by dangerous and ill-designing men, traitorously preparing war. Enough was enough. He had to show them who was boss. The king enlisted more troops in Britain and hired German troops too. He sent ships to blockade the American coast so that the colonists couldn't get any outside supplies. Then his soldiers sat back to wait for the colonial army to fall to pieces. The king's war hardened brutally. Disciplined and well-trained fighting forces included 5 kinds of fighters. Here are the 5 kinds of fighters: British regulars, Hessians, Loyalists, Indians, and the British Navy. I want you to pause it and read about each type, and then tell me which one do you think is most powerful. Read about the different types of the British fighters and tell me which one you think was most powerful. Great. After you're finished and you have paused the video, you're going to continue reading right here. In Europe, soldiers were taught that the fair and honorable way to fight was to march openly into battle in columns, line up in rows, shoulder to shoulder, and advance towards the enemy without firing a shot until they were close enough to be sure hitting of their targets. Since their muskets were not very accurate, they fired together all at once. Troops were traditionally trained to fight on flat land during the daytime in good weather. Nothing had prepared them to fight their way through thick forest, raging rivers, mosquito-infested swamps, and long mountain ranges. You can see here that the uniforms they're wearing do not look ready to go through all of that wild land. Rebel forces. George Washington took command of the Continental Army, the colony's main fighting force, on July 3, 1775. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, he immediately took steps to build a professional army. It wouldn't be easy. Washington despaired over the existence of his volunteers, the constant desertions, and paralyzing lack of food and military supplies. Sometimes, redcoats could shoot rebel soldiers at will because the rebels didn't have enough gunpowder to shoot back. There were 3 types of fighting forces against the British. So just how Britain had different types of soldiers and fighting forces, so did the Americans. George Washington's Continental Army. Go ahead and pause and read about his army. Here are pictures of what the different men could have looked like. The Continental Navy, and the militias. After you've read about each group, I want you to do the same thing. Write down which one do you think was most powerful. The militias, the Continental Navy, or the Continental Army. As difficult as things were for the rebel forces, they did have some strong advantages. Though George Washington drilled his army in British-style warfare, rebel soldiers had learned from fighting the Indians to travel light, hide in the woods and mountains, and use ambushes. That means jumping out unexpectedly, and lightning raids against the unsuspecting enemy. They could move quickly, and their earth-toned homespun and buckskin clothes let them melt into the countryside unseen. The British considered these tactics to be dishonorable. You can see here that the American soldiers are blending in with their surroundings, but the British soldiers stood out more easily. A new nation. While Washington's soldiers and King George's soldiers were fighting one another, the Continental Congress made a crucial decision. Instead of just battling for their rights as citizens of Great Britain, they decided to aim for total American independence. Remember, right now they're all considered citizens of Great Britain, but now they want to be considered a whole separate country. To rally Americans to their cause and get support from Europe, they set to work writing a document that claimed the right of all people to choose their own government. It also placed the blame for every single one of the grievances squarely on the shoulders of King George himself. This document was the Declaration of Independence, and its signers had just given birth to the United States of America. In modern language, here are some of the points it made about the independence and just a few of the things it said about King George, even though it was really Great Britain's Parliament that had made all the laws oppressing the colonies. Go ahead and pause these points of the Declaration of Independence, and I want you to think about which one you think is most important. Supporters of Great Britain thought that the signers were traitors who used the Declaration of Independence to attack their own king and promote war against him. To American rebels, though, King George was a traitor of his own British citizens in America because he refused to uphold their British constitutional rights. The rebels gathered to celebrate their independence. Tremendous crowds of merrymakers beat drums, burned bonfires, held a mock burial of King George, and pulled a gilded statue of the king on horseback off its pedestal and melted it down to make bullets for army muskets. The king was thoroughly dismayed. Tomorrow, I want you to come join me for our next chapter, The Tides of War. You should be thinking about which part of the military on each side was most powerful and what part of the Declaration you think of independence is most important. See you tomorrow.